So my name's Russell Ball and I'm a member of the Ancient Yew Group, and we're in a churchyard in Totteridge in Barnet, North East London. In terms of their longevity, I think the longest living yew tree we've got, there's one in Scotland in Fortingall, and that's estimated to be 5,000 years old. And that's nowhere near dying or fading away. And there's no reason why it couldn't live for another 1 or 2 or 3 or 4,000 years more. Because inherently, yew trees have an internal process whereby they can regenerate themselves, so they can potentially live forever. On a world stage, the ancient yews in Great British churchyards are unique. They're often called a Noah's Ark. So when we're actually talking about caring and managing for these trees in the future, we have to be very, very aware in this generation that what we do doesn't affect those trees, keeps them alive, keeps them well, so for future generations in 1,000 years, they're still here to enjoy. One of the features of an ancient yew or an ancient tree is the fact that it's hollow and they can often have cavities. This is a natural process, a natural aging process of the tree. It provides fantastic biodiversity for a range of bugs and birds and bees, so it's really, really a fantastic feature. In terms of stability, a hollow is more stable than a rod. So now we're going to get into this lovely ancient hollow yew tree. As I said before, with ancient yews being able to regenerate themselves, because of this hollowing natural feature here, you get debris from the foliage falls in. As it rots down, it provides a very rich humus, which is very, very high in organic matter, and the tree can actually feed on itself in terms of regeneration. And what you get is this kind of, well, down here, you get these aerial roots, which now sprout out, go down into the soil to absorb mineral elements and moisture. Another feature for aerial roots is branches which then feed off this humus layer within the centre of the tree, which is hollow. These actually strike roots and they grow up like we've got here. This is a much younger trunk, and in fact what this can do, this will grow up and form a tree within a tree. So as the outer shell of branches on this ancient yew maybe begin to die and decay, this tree in the middle becomes the new yew tree. So in fact, this tree here could live for another 3, 4, 5,000 years old. As this becomes hollow, other trees can then grow within this. So in this way, the tree recycles itself and it could potentially live forever. And that's one of the features that maybe Druids kind of plugged into at an early stage because they saw the life-giving and everlasting properties of ancient yews. So one of the features of ancient yews is the fact that they have hollows and cavities. These are fantastic habitats for a range of biodiversity. I'm actually stood in a cavity here, which could be a fantastic nesting site for a bird. Up in here, we've got a potential nesting site or roosting site for bats. So in fact, these features, which are gnarled and hollow and in some cases decaying, can provide a fantastic hotel, if you like, for a range of biodiversity, bats, bugs and other creatures. In terms of management of ancient yews, often the best thing to do is nothing. We call that a non-intervention policy. That ties into a feature called mass energy ratio, which sounds quite complicated, but I'll explain it because it's quite easy to understand. We've got a tree over here which is possibly about 100, 200 years old. As you can see, the trunk is relatively small, the scaffold branches are relatively small as well, but and that's its mass, yeah? In terms of its energy, on the mass energy ratio, it's got a full crown, lots of dense needles, it's got potential to produce lots of energy via photosynthesis to keep that tree alive. If we look at our 1,000-year-old yew tree over here, in terms of its mass, we've got, as we've seen before, a big trunk, big scaffold limbs, big branches. So it's got a big mass. And if you look at the tree from back here, the actual energy potential of that tree is much, much reduced because it's got quite a thinning canopy as compared with that tree over there. If we were to prune that tree by say 20, 25%, the effect in its vitality would not be that severe. However, if we were to do the same reduction on this tree by 20, 25%, the effect in its vitality could be quite serious. And it could actually send it into what we call a spiral of decline, whereby the tree then starts to actually drop its vitality and starts to die slowly over years. So in terms of mass energy, this ratio here is much less favourable than the mass energy ratio over there. So we mentioned before that ancient yews can live up to 5,000 years, and there's potential for them to live another 2 or 3 or more thousand years. We in this generation are the custodians of those trees, so we've got to be very aware and very conscious that the management of those trees that we undertake has to be sympathetic and doesn't actually lead to their early demise or loss, because that would be a great tragedy. So over their lifetime, which could be 1,000 years or more easily, ancient yews can actually fluctuate in terms of their physiology. Some years they can go yellow or chlorotic. The foliage can become a little bit dense. People often panic and say, oh, we must get a chainsaw onto it to give it a haircut, which is the worst thing you can do. The best thing you can do is be patient and wait. And one of the other things you can do for a tree that's looking chlorotic or yellowing and looking a bit ill is actually to then tend to and look after the root system. Now, looking after the root system of an ancient yew is one of the best things you can do, and one of the techniques that we can employ is adding a mulch underneath the branch spread of the tree, and this could be something as simple as wood chip, which we've got here, centimetres in depth. This is beneficial in a couple of ways. First of all, it locks in soil moisture into the ground, so it can actually see the tree through drought periods. It also creates very favourable conditions for earthworms, which actually move up and down the soil profile and create little aeration tubes in the soil, which is great for root activity. And one of the other benefits of adding mulch is that it creates favourable conditions for mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae actually grow in a symbiotic relationship with tree roots underground, and actually can aid the tree in terms of its vitality, in terms of absorbing essential elements around the soil that then can go into the tree. And it also keeps away grass. Now, ancient yews didn't evolve in amenity grassland situations like we've got here. They evolved in woodlands. If you can imagine, this actively mown grass sward has in the top 60 centimetres of soil a very active root system. They can actually effectively rob trees of essential elements and also water. So the best thing to do is to keep amenity grassland away from ancient yews in terms of creating a favourable rooting environment. Or as we've got here as well, which is good for the cause, is actually to put the leaf litter, which has been raked off the lawn, under the tree. As this rots down, again, this adds organic material. Mulches are very beneficial, but please remember, when you're adding a mulch underneath an ancient yew, please do not add the mulch up against the trunk. We call that volcanoing, which is bad practice, because essentially what it does, it creates a moist environment against the trunk, which then can promote the infestation of a pathogenic fungi called Phytophthora, which actually can actually produce a rot in the trunk. So please, when you're adding mulch, up to the trunk, but not up against the trunk. And the other thing with organic mulches is, because of the natural process of them rotting down, to add organic material to the soil, they will need topping up every, say, 3 to 5 years with more mulch. One of the great debates is ivy management. In this particular case here, we've got some ivy growing up the trunk of this young yew tree here, which at the moment is not causing a problem, but if this ivy was to become more prolific and more dense, there is potential for the ivy then to grow out into the foliage of the tree and actually smother the tree and cause it to actually die, because obviously the ivy then is stopping the tree producing food via photosynthesis. So although ivy can be good for wildlife, you've also got to consider, is it going to smother your ancient yew in the future? If it is so, then it needs to be managed. How I mean by managed is basically cutting it about ½ metre off ground and managing the ivy at that level and below, and not allowing it to grow up and proliferate into the crown. In terms of risk management of ancient yew trees, there's 2 things to consider. There's firstly the risk to people or property. In this particular case, we've got a target, which is a pathway. And if we look up above here, we've got deadwood. Now remember, deadwood is a habitat for biodiversity, but in this particular case, the deadwood's quite small and it poses no risk at all. If this deadwood was to be bigger, then you can do a simple pull test, wearing a helmet and glasses. Throw a small rope over the low deadwood branch. If you can pull it and it snaps, that's fair enough. If you can pull it and it doesn't snap, then obviously that deadwood is safe to leave within the next 12 months, and so it doesn't cause a problem. If you notice any cracks or cavities which are colonised by a fungus which is common on ancient yews, which is called chicken in the woods, it's a bright yellow sulphur coloured fungus which can cause a brittle fracture, then what I recommend before you reach for the chainsaw, actually you consult with your local authority tree officer, or you speak to an approved local tree contractor to see what measures can be taken in terms of managing that tree. In terms of the risk of an ancient tree to itself, this can usually occur when you've got a large spreading ancient yew with large spreading long scaffold branches. Now these physically can have a long lever arm, so you've got a lot of weight at the end. The force acting here can actually cause the branch to snap or snap out that way. So what you can do is actually you can reduce the lever arm back, so you're actually reducing that physical force on the branch against the trunk, and therefore you're looking after that tree in the future. One of the other things in terms of tree stability is actually assisting the tree in putting down a stabiliser, if you like. Now this is a potential branch which if it was a bit longer and this tombstone wasn't in the way, you could actually pin this branch to the ground. At the point at which the branch is pegged into the ground, it will actually set roots. And so if you can imagine, you'll get another tree growing up in this position, and with the connection of the branch to the main trunk, this will actually act as a stabiliser. And if you can imagine that we've got, say, 3 or 4 of these around the outside of this tree, these can actually act as effective stabilisers to keep the tree stable in high winds. So we talked before about reducing or pruning back long lever arms on ancient yews. The other technique that we can use is props. If you imagine this is a long, heavy lever arm going out in this direction, you can actually put in a prop, which is something like a telegraph pole, which actually you can install under the branch, and that actually adds mechanical support to that branch into the future. But one of the key things with using props, as with all supporting systems in trees, you have to review them on a 2 to 3 year basis to make sure they're not actually constricting the branch they're supporting or constricting the trunk they're supporting, and to make sure that the actual prop itself is still in a good state. So the telegraph pole is not rotting and it's still adding mechanical support to these long lever arm branches. Another technique you can use instead of propping is a thing called cable racing, where you actually choose, if there's one, a central strong trunk in the middle of the tree, and then you run cables out to branches which need support, usually by a thin cable. Before the techniques of cable bracing and propping were employed, I've actually seen quite a lot of ancient yews wrapped up like a Christmas tree with lots of chains and cable in order to keep the bole intact. Obviously now is outdated practice. However, where you have got that with an ancient yew, the worst thing to do is to take those chains off, because the tree could actually fall apart. The best thing to do is to assess the tree, undertake some crown reduction of that tree, because obviously it's been provided support by that cabling or by that chaining around the trunk, and if you take that off, the tree could just fall apart. So the thing is reduce, and then when it comes to taking the chains or the cable out, which are wrapping around the trunk, if the cable is actually being swallowed, if you like, by the trunk, by the wood, the worst thing to do is pull the cable out, because actually you can create more damage. The best thing to do is, where the cable is being engulfed by the tree, is leave that in situ and just cut the cable either side to relieve the tension around the tree, and just leave the tree to grow over that cable or that chain. But as I say, it's not best practice anymore, and you shouldn't be wrapping trees with chains or braces or cables. One of the first steps to consider in terms of managing ancient yews is the statutory protection they may have. This can come in 2 forms. Firstly, a TPO or a tree preservation order, and secondly, if the tree is growing in a conservation area. Now, in both cases, you have to contact your local council. In terms of a TPO, that process takes 8 weeks in order to get permission for any tree works. In terms of a conservation area, that process is 6 weeks in order for you to get written consent. If you fail to do that, you then can get a criminal record and a fine. So it's worth checking out on the statutory protection of trees before you do any tree works. The other factor to consider alongside tree preservation orders and conservation areas is a faculty, effectively a permission from your local diocese office in order to undertake the works before you do that. So we talked about ancient yews having a natural feature of hollowing. Now some people regard that as a convenient storage area for petrol tanks, for cement, for diesel, for oil. These things are all toxic to trees, so please don't consider a hollow tree as a kind of a shed where you can store material. Please keep the hollow clear of any material, obviously, because that could harm the tree in the future. So we've seen today how ancient yews are so very, very important for their cultural and historical value. And we've also seen that in Great Britain, how churchyards are so important in terms of providing a Noah's Ark, a sanctity for these trees to survive. But there's no reason to doubt that the much younger tree behind me, after 500 years, will become a veteran. After 1,000 years, will become an ancient yew tree. And that with proper care and attention, this tree could be with us for thousands and thousands of years to come.